G'day crew, I'm Todd from Toxic Garage Customs. Thanks for joining me again. In this video we're going to do the final of the mounts for the cab onto the chassis with the International. So these are the mounts that go from near where the tray is into the rear section of the cab. So I'm going to hand it over to the video. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you. On Holden One tonners, they have a brace or a mount that goes onto the cab from this part of the chassis. So this is just behind the cab. They have a brace that bolts onto here. So there's a rubber mount just there, rubber bush, and it goes the other side of this frame. And then this bolt goes through, and then a steel plate. This isn't it, but essentially the brace is a steel plate that sits between this nut and this nut, and you tighten the nut up. So the brace is sort of a box section that mounts to the back of the cab, so it's rigidly mounted to the cab, and then that rubber mounts the cab to this part of the chassis. Now what it does is that it creates triangulation, creates triangular strength to stop the chassis from bending in the middle, because this type of chassis, that's the strength through it there, that's the only strength through that area there, whereas by bracing it here, it makes the cab a structural brace within this type of chassis setup. So they have to have something like that in them. So previously I've mounted the cab to the subframe that I built, and you've seen those videos. So the cab is rigidly mounted there, which is great. The cab's not going to fall off, but I need to put the strength back into the whole structure of the way those chassis are designed by mounting this chassis to this cab. Now people do it in other ways by doing other special subframes and so on. That's not the way I'm going about. I'm going to try and duplicate. Now what I did on Toxic was I actually built essentially a mount onto the back of the cab, ran this bolt through and do the nut up exactly as Holden did it. However, I don't want to do it that way this time, because I do feel it's not major, but I do feel that it puts a little bit of stress onto parts of the cab that, I don't know, weren't necessarily designed for that. I have never had a problem, but I just want to do this one differently. So what I'm going to do, and there's one of these braces on this side, there's one on the other side. What I'm going to do is pick up off my subframe. So this subframe is rigidly mounted to the bottom of this cab. So it's rubber mounted to the chassis, but it is rigidly mounted to the cab. So it's bolted on there. So what I'm going to do is bring an extension of that subframe up in steel, and then I'm going to mount this into that extension. So rather than bracing to the body of the cab, I'll be bracing to the subframe, which in effect has become part of the cab. If I was to undo the bolts from underneath the chassis, I could lift the cab off the chassis with that subframe bolted to it. So it's a rigid component of it. So what I'm thinking of doing is getting something, this is 50 by 75, piece the subframe. I'm thinking of getting something like this, piece of 50 by 50, 5mm wall, and putting that there and bringing it up, and then getting some sort of plate and bringing it across up at that height, bringing it across so that I can run that bolt through the middle of a plate, not this plate with these holes in it, it's just something I've got, run that bolt through the middle of a plate like this that is fixed to that. Now it'll need strengthening, it'll need gusseting to stop it twisting and so on, but essentially I'm picking up this point off the subframe, bringing it up higher to mount that to create the triangulation there. Now I went through all sorts of complicated kinds of designs, and really at the end of the day it doesn't need to be complicated. Now to add extra strength, once I've got that in place, I'll probably put a fish plate, well not probably, I will put a fish plate, so basically a piece of steel that goes from here across to there on each side of that to put strength in there, so that they're not just depending on the weld there, it's spreading the load, spreading the love, move it across like that, and I'll probably make it so that it triangulates up a bit as well, just to bring it up as high as I can to really spread that load over as much of the surface as I can, again on both sides. I'll box this in on the bottom, box it in on the top, and so on, remembering to leave a hole in the bottom of it so moisture can evaporate or can get out of there. If you do a closed unit, then moisture can get trapped in there, so having some sort of weep hole at the bottom is always suggested. So again, that through there, I'll put some sort of gusseting and so on. Again, could be prototype and then real thing, or it could just be I get it right in the first place. We'll see. Now, if I have any further concerns, if I want to make it stronger, I'll have one of these on this side, one on the other side. I could run something across between them as well to create a whole boxed in section, and I will probably end up doing that. What I do have is that the cab will interfere to a certain extent with the steel, so I may have to curve the steel to get it to work, or I may use a thinner diameter steel that I can just move behind the line of the cab. So in other words, I could run a thinner bar across to come into the side of my subframe extension, just a brace between the two. I think that's a plan, and I think with the materials I've got hanging around, I can at least make up a prototype, if not the final version. So let's start cutting. As far as the actual size of the thing that I'm building goes, I'm going to bring that additional brace that I'm putting in. It's a bit hard to transfer this line through exactly. I'm going to bring it up to this height here. That frame there. So I was trying to show you with that, but I can't. I'm going to bring it up so that this piece that I'm building is the same height as this, and that way anything that I run across I can run at the same height, and that way it's not going to interfere with tray height. I can make it so it's not particularly visible or not visible at all once it's all put together. It should look neat and tidy. So I'm going to cut this to that height. Before I cut my second one, just make sure the first one's right. So I've got it clamped at the height I want down the bottom. Comes across, right height there. So I've already marked the other one out, but before cutting it, I just want to make sure this one was right. So I think that's going to work quite well. It's just convenient. I never capped the end of the subframe, always intended to. So this piece will actually become the cap. So that's good. If you haven't seen the earlier videos of this, I'm using the Rare Spares body mount kit, HQ JXZ WB 1-tonner, bolts included. So this came, there was 2 boxes, but it came with all the mounts, washers and hardware and so on. Those spring washers aren't included, but all the various things to do exactly as it says, mount a cab to a chassis. Included in that was the replacement bushers for the 1-tonner. So these are the bushers that were coming out of the chassis to mount to the back of the cab, and there's a crush tube in there, so I've got to reuse that by the looks of things because there's not a new one there. So I'll take that out and clean it up. But these, they're not completely destroyed, but they're compressed. So I'll put these bushers here in, the new ones. Look a bit undersized, but I'm going to assume that they're the right size, that they're the right bushers. Yeah, so they sit in there snug like that, whereas these ones are a smaller diameter. It's all I've got, and it's supposed to be a whole kit, so I'm going to run with it. But if I've got any doubts, then I can always replace them later. There's nothing here that is bigger, and this is the 4 that I've got, so I'm going to run with it. That's the ones I meant to use. As I said, if I've got doubts, I can replace them later. But what I'm doing at the moment, I've taken the bolt out. I noticed the bolt on the driver's side has been cut off. The one on the passenger side is longer. It's about, I don't know, 3/4 of an inch longer. I'll see if I can run with this at the moment, but I will replace them with new hardware later. I do have another bolt that is a bit longer, but the threads may not be long enough for my purpose. That's adjustment as the bushes wear to be able to tighten the nuts forward or back to be able to take the slack looseness out of the mount from the chassis to the cab. So that's important, that there's enough threads there. But what I'm going to do, I'll start off with this bolt. I'll give everything a bit of a clean up. That's what I do, and then I will go along and I will assemble the new bushes onto it. This will come on later, and then it comes through the chassis and bolt it all back together and so on. And the reason being that way that when I'm making my, listen to that, that's a 327 HR station wagon, ex-street machine car, one of my neighbours. So I will if you didn't hear that, then that's what it was. So yeah, I'll put all that together, and that way when I'm building this bracketry, then at least I've got full bushes there that aren't squashed, because I'm sure regardless of the diameter they're supposed to be about that thickness. So that's where I will run. Just got to assemble that, clean it up, then I'll take you back and I'll show you what that looks like back on the cab, and then we can start making the next part of the brace. Okie dokie, so I've got the hardware cleaned up. We have the bolt that I'm going to replace. Got the large washer. It will come in from the back of this here, and on the back there is also, like inside, there is another one of those large dish sort of washers. So the idea is that the bushing sits between two of those washers, gets squashed into there, and then there's more bushing and washer on the other side with the crush tube. And the idea of the crush tube is to stop the bushes getting crushed any thinner than the thickness, the length of the tube. So I tried to do this a moment ago and couldn't get the thing together because it was quite a tight fit. So this is take two. Let's see if I can get it together this time. Bit of Rare Spares rubber magic. I'm not promoting them, but I do use their product because it seems to work. I use it for making door seals more supple. Put this on, trying to get the bush onto crush tube. Okay, that's on. That was take two. Didn't want to work the first time because it was too tight, but the rubber seal, the rubber magic helped. Only 1 or 2 cuts on my hands. Now, where's the other washer? Okay, got the bushes in, got the bolt through. The bolt ultimately will be about another 3/4 of an inch long, and got the bushes there. Now if I push on this, so I've got this done up until I can't go any further because the crush tube is stopping it from going any further. And what it does, it allows for that still to be rubber mounted there. You should be able to see this moving, so that's as tight as it gets. So that allows that to move. So it's not rigid, it's not going to snap or fracture. So now I need to make the brace that comes up off this. I have this piece of flat bar that's 100mm wide, I believe, and it's 5mm thick. I think that'll be the perfect thing for this. So that's what I'll make up the secondary part of the brace that comes across here. Now I'm going to fish plate across the bottom, and that fish plate will either be welded on for the strength or it will become the plate. It will be welded to half and bolted onto the other half, so whichever way I go. So I'm going to run this down to in line with the top of my subframe, and the reason being that way I'm using the big 100mm width of this as a brace. Not only is it picking up this, but it's running full length down to this point to make it really strong. I guess I could also run the fish plate first and run this over the top, which would mean that this would run right the way down to the bottom, which doesn't sound like a bad idea either. Let's play around with that. I believe that by making up the fish plate to come across here, and I'm just going to make it a rectangle, so it's going to pick up from here, run across the top of the subframe, and then it's going to bridge that whole area. I'll make one on each side. So this is 50mm wide and this is 70mm wide. So I'm going to make the plate 70mm tall and 120mm long, so it'll be 50mm plus 70mm, which means that the patch that touches the original subframe will be a 70 by 70mm square, which I think will be completely fine. And what it'll allow me is I can either weld that on and get it really strong, if that's the way I go, or I can diagonally mount 2 bolts through it, one in the top corner, one in the bottom corner, put a crush tube between there as well, so that when I tighten it up, the pipe doesn't get crushed. So by making the fish plates up, then it means that I can either weld them on or I can bolt them on, whatever I choose. That design shouldn't need to change. So I've decided that I'm going to make that out of my umbrella stand. If you haven't seen that before, it's some 6mm plate that I've got. Used it for several things on this, and I'll use it for more yet. So I'm going to make that, and then once it's there, then I'm going to use this here, and I could use umbrella stand as well, I guess, but I've got this and it's the right width. The width of this actually works really well. It positions that bolt nicely in the center. So I'll run this from top to bottom to go over the top of my fish plate, so that the whole lot just adds layers of strength. Because what I don't want is it failing at that junction point through the cab doing this. I don't want it failing anywhere, but I don't want it failing there. So I think it'll have a great amount of strength. So I've got those fish plates tacked on, one on either side, and it's sitting nicely up against this, up against the subframe. You can see the line that it comes up through there. So what I'm going to do is transfer this point here across from the bolt onto that upright piece, so that I know where to weld my piece of plate that's going to be coming up this way. So we've made up this plate. It's about 100mm wide, 5mm thick. I'm not sure exactly how long it is, but it's that long from there to there. So this notch here is going to go over my fish plate, like that. And as I said, I will put some gusseting from here across to there, same there, so that it gives it plenty of strength. I'll probably trim off some of this stuff on the bottom. It doesn't need to be where it is. But what I'm just trying to get right at the moment is to mark the centre for where the this bolt comes through. I've actually already started. I've just put a couple of Sharpie markers there. It looks inaccurate at the moment, but it's just so that I can get a feel for where it needs to be. So it's sitting pretty well there. So I can see from my marks there, I've already scratched a mark there, so that one I can transfer down with a square. And then if I get my scribe, which I dropped on the ground, okay, so I get my scribe. So I've just got a couple of little lines there, this here and this here, just scratched over the top of blue Sharpie marker so I can see them. I'm just going to run a square down in each direction to find the centre, drill a hole, and I'll make it slightly oversized for that so that I can come in here, push that onto where it needs to be, tack it in place. So I've got my plate here. Just going to use a simple combination square. Doesn't matter what sort of square you use. In fact, if you've got something that you know is square on the corner, you can even use that to transfer marks through. But it's really what a square is for. So I'm just going to come in off my straight edge on my material here and pick up this point here. Stretch a line. And I'll check that I've got a square here. Yep, so I've cut that square. And then I'm going to come in off that edge, pick up my scribe line here. And now I have a perfect centre for where it is. Now, the reason I did it that way, I had the bolt sitting sort of taking up the whole area, so I couldn't find the dead centre, so I marked where the circle was. I marked a point and a point, and now I've just transferred those points in to find the centre. Now I'm going to drill a hole. Okay, so you saw me drilling the holes there. Try and get you in line here. So you can see, for some reason my camera's on an angle. You'll see that this plate is just sitting there. So that's exactly where it needs to go. That was first fitment. So the hole is only just big enough for the bolt. So I'll probably enlarge it a bit. I don't like them being too close. It needs a little bit of air around it so it doesn't damage the thread of the bolt, but also to be able to get it on and off. Because this is rubber mounted, there's a possibility that at some point in time the bolt will want to sit slightly up or slightly down or slightly in or out. And if the hole is too tight there, it'll be hard to get it in or out or on. So what I'm thinking still at the moment is that I will probably make it so that to remove it, I take the bolt out of inside here and take that out. I think that will be an acceptable way to go about it. I'm not going to rush into it. I'll try or fit it with it all just sort of sitting there like that. And before I go making that final, so before I go welding this on, I'll make sure that I can get it on and off as if I was removing it this way. If I have trouble with that, then I will end up bolting it through here. My brain tells me I should do that, but we'll see. So this is the plate where it needs to go. I'm happy with that. So I'm going to tack that in place. I'm going to tack it in place while it's here. I am right next to the fuel tank, so it's with a bit of trepidation. So I'm just going to tack it in place, and then once I've got it tacked in place, I'm going to see if I can get this bolt out and remove the whole thing, and if I can, then I'll proceed that way. However, prior to doing that, I'm going to make this hole a little bit bigger. Wasn't happy with the first position, so I broke the tack off, and now I'm going to put it on again, and that's why we tack. Now, as I weld that, I can feel it wants to pull that way. So I'm trying to hold it in place as best I can. But you need to always be aware that the heat will pull the metal in ways that you might not want it to. Holding it by hand is the least recommended way of doing it. But sometimes you do what you need to do. And my whole bracket moved. I think I'm pretty happy with that. Chuck another tack on. Okay, so I think 2 tacks should be enough to hold that in place for the moment. Just see whether I can get it off. So before I try and pull it off, I'll show you what the plan is. So all of this will be rigidly mounted, and I've said that a number of times now, so I don't need to keep saying that. And then this will be bolted onto there. I've said it a few times, so it'll be a longer bolt. That'll go on there, have a spring washer, keep it tight, and all the rest of it. So this will all be rigidly bolted to that, and then you've got the rubber mount. So what I'm hoping I can do when I want to remove it at any point in time, if I do weld it there, or even if I bolt it, I guess, is that I want to be able to take that nut off, put a spanner in here to hold that, and then coming through the back here, bring in a ratchet, get it on the back of the bolt, and undo it. And what I'm hoping I will be able to do is remove the bolt to be able to remove the bracket. So I haven't taken the bolt right the way out, because what I've just realised is that if I just undo it to the point where it's still holding that nut just there, then I really don't have to take the whole thing off, because if I'm taking the cab off, then I take the bolts off out of here, and the other side, the ones at the front and so on, that hold the cab on. If you're not sure exactly where they are, then have a look at the earlier videos of mounting the cab. But realistically, I should be able to just lift this whole cab up and even leave that there. Now, okay, it's only taking it out a little bit further, but I just stopped short of doing that because it seemed that I actually didn't have to do it. So I've taken the bolt out now. The nut theoretically should just fall away. And now I can remove that. I think that means I'm going to weld that plate onto that subframe and just make this as one entity that stays as it is. I don't think I need to go to the trouble of making that part down there removable as well. I'm happy with that, so based on that, I'm now going to take this whole assembly off and I'm going to take it to my bench and try to weld it without anything moving. And I think I'll throw some gusseting in it as well, because why not? I think I can. Happy with that. Okay, it was no real surprise to me, but once I had welded this plate in place under the cab, I couldn't get this piece back out again past the subframe and the chassis and so on, because there just wasn't enough room. But that's not going to be a problem in the long run, because in the long run it won't be, I'm going to fix it, I'm going to weld it to the frame, I've decided, and so it won't need to be removable. It's just a problem at the moment. If I wanted to, I could lift the whole cab off. I did try jacking the cab up at the back and it still didn't give me enough room. Undid some bolts, jacked it up. So what I've decided I'm going to do, and I don't think it's going to affect anything strength-wise, to get it in and out just for the moment, I'm going to cut the corner off here and I'll cut the corner off there. And what it means is that I'll be able to slide it back off the frame, tilt it like that, and then slide it up. You won't be able to see that, and it really doesn't matter long run, but I'm just doing that. So if you wonder why the corners are cut off there later, then that's the case. Also, this piece that's going on here, and this has got nothing to do with being able to remove it, but roughly speaking, I'm going to cut it off on a 45 on the bottom there, because it really doesn't need that extra metal down there. So I'll just clean it off. Cut it off, I should say. So, a fair while later, I've got a bracket. I haven't fitted it on yet. You'll see when I see whether it works. Well, it's not really a bracket. I'm going to call it a subframe extension. So it's still hot, that's why I put my gloves on. So this is what we have. I've got that central tube, that's the bottom, so I put a hole in it so that water can get out. So these wings just here are the part that slide onto the subframe. And then this plate here is the one that the mount will go onto. So that's a pretty solid bit of gear. So you can see this is that plate that I made. So the fish plate, as I'm calling it, just here on either side. And then I've got this longitudinal brace, if that's the right term. Oh, it's hot. This brace going down over the top, so it's welded over there as well. And then I've got gusseting is there as well. So I'm pretty sure this thing's going to be strong enough. So I'm going to see if I can not burn my hand and put this onto the cab, and I'll show you what it looks like. Well, I'm really happy with that. Sorry about the light in the background there. So what we have here is got the plate there, got the bolts tightened up. So this is actually, the bolt was in. I did have to jack the cab up to get this in, but again, that's never going to be a problem once it's installed as a permanent fixture. It was just to get it in for the moment. Haven't welded any of this on yet. I may or may not trim that corner off. It just gives a bit more surface area of weld around there, but I think there's plenty of contact area anyway. So it'll be welded across here, down through here, around here, across the bottom. Same on the other side. So this is nice and nicely mounted. It fits up really well. So what I've done, I've installed that whole structure that I showed you before loosely on there. I've got this in place. I'll make sure that all my cab mounts and everything are tightened up so that this subframe is where it needs to be. And then once I've got that, then I'll tack this in place. I'm not going to try and weld it with the cab in place, but the cab's got to come off later at some point anyway. What I am just looking at here is that so that this doesn't move, I will probably put another gusset from here down to there. So mounting onto this gusset, and this gusset is welded onto a solid plate which is welded onto the subframe. So I think if I put a triangular gusset from here down to here, then it'll just resist the flex through there. It's braced on that end. It may be overkill, don't really care, it'll be good. And if I ever had any concerns, I could put a triangular gusset from there down to there as well. I don't know if I'll do that or not. I'm pretty happy with the strength of this. I think it's good. So let's stand back. So what we know is that this needs to be braced, normally braced onto the back of the Holden 1-tonner cab. This subframe that I've made is essentially now a component of that cab. So all I've done is built like an exoskeleton, so an outside skeleton along the bottom of the cab that comes up here and then mounts to there. So to my way of thinking, it's doing the same thing as if I was mounting it to the back of the cab. Now, a couple of little neat trim things I might do is I think potentially I might want to take maybe 10mm off the side of this, so that if I run sides, which I will be running sides along here once I get a tray on it, so I'll be running sides along there to cover all this prettiness. I may want to just trim this back maybe 10mm so it's in line with this here, so I can get a cover that sits nice and close to that, and then the filler neck will just be coming out of that. So that's alright. Yeah, so I'm happy with it. I think it's looking good. Well, it is looking good. I'm very pleased with it. Now, just as a bit of an interesting fact, the 1-tonners are about 150mm longer, or 6 inches longer through this part here. So through this area here, basically. So, and the utes, they're longer than the utes and the panel van chassis. The ute and panel van chassis don't have this brace, and the reason being is that the 1-tonner has a cab and then it has a chassis. The utes and panel vans, the body continues along right the way from the back, right the way through to the front. So they're actually mounted in other points as well. So the back of the body makes it so that the whole body construction becomes part of the bracing for the chassis. So the 1-tonners, they don't have a back on them. Well, they have a separate back, a tray. So therefore, that's why this piece is necessary. And that's why this piece that I've just built is necessary. So if you're using a 1-tonner chassis, you've got to do this. If you're using a ute chassis, which I did on Toxic, I actually got a piece of this, modified it. So I cut that off a 1-tonner, modified it, and essentially built a very similar structure to this, but I mounted it to the back of the cab rather than to the subframe. But I turned my ute chassis into a 1-tonner chassis. It was just 6 inches shorter than a 1-tonner chassis. So that's why I haven't done this exact method before, because I haven't used a 1-tonner chassis before. I made a 1-tonner chassis. So there we have it. Now the only other thing, I'll show you this further and further, but as I was saying, I won't use this bar, this tube, it'll be bigger than this, but I may run something across here to pick up the other side, to brace the two between there if I feel I need any extra strength. But I'll probably use a 50mm tube and narrow it through the middle, because the body will be in the way, because the body is curved across the back. Oh, one thing I forgot to mention was that when I cut the corner off the bottom of this large rectangle, the piece that came off is what I used to make this gusset, because it was a triangle, and I just cut the ends off so they were flat, because I don't like having them pointy on the end there. So yeah, so that piece there came off there. And that is the full ingredients of that brace. This was a piece of umbrella stand. That was my fish plates on either side. This is what I made the brace that goes up and down. I cut the corner of that to make my gusset. And this was the thing that held it all together. So that was the components. And I did buy this some time ago. I didn't buy it for this, I bought it some time ago. And I would have bought that at some time as well. But that was an offcut. This was an umbrella stand, and this was lying around. So once again, I don't know what's it cost me, $15 if that's what I had to pay for that. So that's what it cost, and some time. So I hope that video was helpful. We've now fully mounted the cab onto the chassis. We've done the subframe underneath, we've done the radiator support for the front panels also, and now we've braced that rear section of the cab onto the chassis. As far as I'm concerned, that thing is fully mounted. Now, I didn't show you the whole thing. I've duplicated that whole process on the other side, and there's a little bit of extra welding to be done once the cab comes off. But other than that, it is really done. So you can go forth and mount an International cab onto a Holden chassis with confidence. So I hope you enjoyed. Thank you.